In 1789, angry crowds stormed a medieval prison in Paris. They weren't just freeing prisoners, they were breaking the chains of monarchy, privilege, and centuries of inequality. This was the French Revolution, a decade of chaos that toppled kings, unleashed terror, and gave birth to modern democracy. Let's get into it. But first, let's do a quick review of some key terms you'll need to know to crush this quiz at the end of the video. Absolute monarchy, rule by a king or queen with complete authority. Constitutional monarchy, rule by a king or queen whose powers are limited by a constitution. Aristocracy, rule by a hereditary elite or nobility. Democracy, rule by the people, often through elected representatives. Enlightenment, an intellectual movement emphasizing reason, individualism, and human rights. And finally, sans-culottes, the radical working-class citizens of Paris during the French Revolution. Okay, let's get to it. By the late 18th century, France was a country on the edge of collapse. A bankrupt economy, food shortages, and rigid social inequality combined with new ideas of liberty and equality to create a volatile mix. Years of war, especially helping America in its own revolution, had left France drowning in debt. Poor harvests meant that bread, the staple food for ordinary people, was both scarce and expensive. And, worst of all, the privileged few were getting richer while the many suffered. French society was split into three so-called estates. The first estate consisted of the clergy, and the second, the nobility. Together, these two groups made up only about 2% of the population, yet they held most of the wealth and power. The first and second estates enjoyed enormous privileges. They did not have to pay most taxes, and they had exemption from most forms of labor. Meanwhile, the burden of taxation fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the commoners, merchants, artisans, peasants, and urban workers, who made up 98% of the population. This rigid social hierarchy offered little opportunity for advancement. If you were born a peasant, you were likely to remain a peasant your whole life. Worse still, the nobility controlled the government, which meant that the king could pass laws benefiting the wealthy and powerful while the majority of the population had no voice in the political process. But it was the emergence of new ideas that proved most explosive. The intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment emphasized the use of reason to challenge traditional authority, and it celebrated the individual as the highest authority in moral and political matters. Thinkers like John Locke argued that all people are created equal and that government must protect the natural rights of its citizens. Writers like Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau advocated for separation of power in government and popular sovereignty, rule by the people. Ideas like these undermined the legitimacy of absolute monarchy and inspired calls for greater individual freedom and equality. The stage was set for revolution. All it needed was a spark. In 1789, desperate to fix the economy, King Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General, a representative body that had not met since 1614. Voting in the Estates General had long been conducted by estate, meaning that each estate had one vote regardless of how many representatives it had. This meant that the first two estates could outvote the third and pass laws that benefited the privileged minority. Now, the third estate, the largest and most resentful, demanded that voting be conducted by head to give them more power. When the king rejected this demand, representatives of the Third Estate broke away from the Estates General and declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the French people. On June 20, 1789, members of the National Assembly took a solemn oath in a small room at a nearby tennis court not to disband until they had drafted a constitution for France. This famous tennis court oath showed the determination of the French people to take control of their own destiny. Within days, Parisians were storming the Bastille, a crumbling medieval fortress and prison that had come to symbolize royal tyranny. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, is regarded as the symbolic start of the French Revolution. The fortress fell after only a few hours, and the king's authority effectively ended with the taking of the Bastille. Prisoners were freed, weapons were seized, and the people of Paris reveled in their newfound freedom. Each year on July, the French celebrate Bastille Day, the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, as their national holiday. After the fall of the Bastille, the National Assembly set about creating a new government for France. On August 4, 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which proclaimed the natural rights of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Over the next few weeks, they passed a series of reforms aimed at ending the aristocratic privileges that had long dominated French life. Feudalism, the system of mutual obligations between landlords and peasants, was abolished, along with the taille, the ancient system of tax farming. For a moment, it seemed as though France was going to become a constitutional monarchy in which the power of the king would be limited by a constitution and an elected legislature. But meanwhile, events abroad threatened this vision of limited change. Other European monarchies saw the French Revolution as a threat to their own power and privilege. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by the spread of democratic ideas, decided to intervene in France. In April 1792, Prussian and Austrian troops crossed into France and began their invasion. As war with Austria and Prussia loomed, moderates lost influence and radicals took charge. By September 1792, the monarchy had been abolished and France was declared a republic. Soon after, Louis XVI was beheaded. His widow, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate. Now, radicals led the way. The revolution turned increasingly violent and unstable. A new political club, the Society of Revolutionary Republicans, emerged to promote the ideals of the revolution. At its center was a group of well-educated middle-class lawyers known as the Jacobins, who used newspapers and public meetings to promote their radical agenda. The most radical of these Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre, a shrewd politician who personified the violence and turmoil of the French Revolution. Robespierre rose to prominence during the Reign of Terror, a period of intense civil war and violence when thousands were executed by guillotine on suspicion of counter-revolution or simply of holding unpopular opinions. In fact, anyone who opposed the revolution could be arrested and sent to the guillotine, even former revolutionaries. After Robespierre fell from power, a new government called the Directory came to power in 1795. The Directory was a weak and corrupt government hated by most of the French people. France longed for a return to the ideals of the Revolution and, above all, for stability. The Directory failed to deliver on either front. In 1799, a brilliant young general named Napoleon Bonaparte returned from a successful military campaign in Italy and took advantage of growing instability in France to seize power in a coup d'état, ending the French Revolution and establishing himself as the first consul. Later, he would make himself emperor. In 1804, Napoleon would go on to conquer much of Europe, spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across the continent. Although it ended in dictatorship, the French Revolution had profound consequences. It ended absolute monarchy in France and inspired revolutions across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Above all, it established the principles of citizenship, equality before the law, the separation of church and state, and the right to political representation. The French Revolution remains one of the most important events in world history, a pivotal moment in the transition from traditional to modern society. Closing line. The French Revolution began with bread riots and ended with the rise of an emperor, but in between, it destroyed a monarchy, unleashed terror, and planted the seeds of liberty and equality that continue to shape our world today. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to see more. We've got videos on all kinds of ancient and medieval history, plus the rest of the World War II timeline. Click here to keep learning.